What is the first image that comes to your mind when you hear the word trauma? Is it a car crash? Is it violence in the family? Is it war? These are severe and traumatizing events for sure, but what if I'm telling you that instead silent trauma causes many challenges we deal with, such as attachment and relationship problems, constant shame, and heavy emotional outbreaks? What if I'm telling you that your wounds from the past are not the result of severe events, but of the things that didn't happen that should have? Today you will attain clarity what emotional neglect is. You will understand how emotional neglect from the past shapes our present and future, and which challenges this means to us. And you will learn a process how to break free and relearn proper emotional processing in the here and now. Definitely stay with me for the full episode today so you won't miss the solution that might change your relationships and emotional perception forever. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert. Today we talk about emotional neglect and how we can heal from our wounds from the past. And first of all, a disclaimer up front. I'm not a health professional, and the contents in this video are not to be understood as therapeutic medical instructions or advice, and everything I say here is based on research, my work with therapists, or personal experience. And also you can listen to this full episode on your favorite podcast platform, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. You find all the links of the resources shown in this episode in the description below. Trauma. For many people, this term is, as I said, still abstract. And for some of us, it's something we cannot really identify ourselves with. But most of us, as I said in the intro, have a clear idea or an image that comes to our mind when we say that word, when we talk about trauma. And this image is for most people related to events like car accidents, to war events, to fights, to physical abuse and violence. And this is what most of us associate with being traumatic or with causing wounds. Especially when talking about childhood, many people will say at this point, traumatized? I didn't experience any form of trauma. My childhood was great and I didn't experience any horrible things. I can't pinpoint anything that's like a really impactful event that shaped me in a wrong way. That may be true, and I have always believed that as well, but there is one fundamental conception here about trauma, because it doesn't always has to do with the things that happen to you. Have you ever thought about that things that didn't happen to you also could be experienced as traumatic, or could be something that shook up your perception when you were younger? And I ask you that question because think about, were there situations where you had the feeling that you didn't get what you needed in these situations when you were younger? So first of all, let's define what trauma actually is. A trauma, Greek from wound, is not the events that happen to you, so not all the things that you might experience as traumatic, as severe, but it's the wound that these events caused inside you. And there are two types, two different versions, you would say, of trauma. The first one is the classical PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder in medical literature. Gabor Mate refers to PTSD as the capital T trauma, and that's what most of us would imagine when we talk about that topic. Severe events like sexual or physical abuse, a parent dying when you were young, a parent in jail, accidents, when your parents were mentally ill, when your caregivers were violating, when you experienced divorce in pretty early age. These are events with a severe impact on the life of a human being. And the second type of trauma is what we call in medical literature childhood or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Gabor Mate calls it the tiny T trauma. And tiny T trauma, CPTSD, call it however you want, that's related to not the bad things that happened, but all the good things that didn't happen to you, but that should have happened. So the causes for CPTSD are therefore, for example, neglecting certain needs as a child. Especially, and this is where we talk about emotional neglect here, your emotional needs. Needs for attention, needs for love, for acceptance, for being seen, being heard, freedom to experience all the emotions. That already underlines what we will talk about now in this episode, the freedom to experience all these emotions. And this freedom is interfered by neglect from the caregivers. Now, this emotional neglect, when you experience that as a young child, then this emotional neglect is creating blind spots in our adult lives. We need this freedom of expressing all of our emotions from the beginning of our life because it's so important for our development of cognition and our emotional perception and processing. And if we didn't have the ability to learn that, then symptoms like PTSD, complex PTSD, emotional dysregulation, attachment and relationship issues are all linked to that emotional neglect in early childhood. Now, what happens if we experienced emotional neglect in our childhood? To pinpoint it in simple terms, childhood emotional neglect, we also call it ENC, leads to a disconnect between our subjective inner world, so the things we feel, the needs we have, everything that's going on within us, and the objective outer world, so the things around us, the camera in front of me, the people I'm interacting with, the place I'm sitting here. When we have this disconnect as individuals, what's common here, that's also what my therapist explained to me, is that instead of seeing us as a subject, we become an object ourselves of the outer world. When you have talked to therapists, you will see that many of them tell that to you, that their clients often report that they see themselves from above or from the outside. And that's the actual reason, because they are they're an object of their own perception. But usually when you have a healthy view on the world and you have learned to be connected and aligned with your emotions and needs, then you are the subject that directly perceives the outside world and the objects from their own inner perspective. The major problem that results out of emotional neglect in one sentence is that, first of all, we didn't learn to feel that there is a relationship between our inner world and the outer world, and therefore, secondly, we didn't learn, and that's the important part, how this connection may feel like. Because this process of learning, and you will see that in the next examples, early on how this connection actually feels like was interfered, was disrupted by the experience, by the traumatic experience we've made. I will give you a clear example of how that actually feels like, and then you can see if you also identify with that concept. But first of all, I want to give you another definition here so that you totally understand the differences between PTSD and also emotional neglect. So trauma, classically, PTSD, is defined as a disruption of an existing system of emotional perception and processing. Sounds pretty complicated, but what I actually mean by that is that when you, for example, are 16 years old and a parent, for example, your dad dies, then that's a horrible event, which I do not wish to anyone. But up to this point, the first 16 years could be pretty good for you. You can be happy, fulfilled, and then there is this traumatic event happening to you, and after that, you may deal with PTSD symptoms, but there definitely is a before. So your perception of the world and how you perceive emotions may be disrupted on that specific day. That's PTSD. Then we have CPTSD, childhood complex post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, caused by emotional neglect. Then emotional neglect is interfering with the process of forming these systems. That usually happens pretty early in life. So you never really learned how healthy emotional perception actually feels like. And that's the difference, because there is no before. From the beginning, most probably, you already didn't learn how healthy emotional processing works. And that's actually what's causing the symptoms in your adulthood. Why is the focus on emotions so important? Children often learn early on, and still today, the narrative that it's better and easier to suppress emotions, to toughen up, and to not be so sensitive. Maybe you also experienced that in your life. But, well, there are people who are more sensitive, who have a sensory processing sensitivity, who have ADHD, who have autism, things like this. For example, in our community. And not feeling emotions, suppressing emotions to have an easier life is an illusion, because that's far from the truth, especially for really sensitive individuals. Emotions are really, really important pieces of information for us, and these pieces are crucial for us human beings to recognize and process in order to find our way within society and our daily lives, to better connect what we feel inside and check up with the outside. If we suppress and ignore emotions because we think and deeply believe that it's bad to be sensitive or that we are not tough enough, then we lose our ability to make good decisions and lose the abilities to stay aligned with us, with what we feel and what we need, and also lose the ability to be connected with our beloved ones, with other people. We can't set clear boundaries and make decisions for ourselves, and therefore we can't have healthy relationships with other people or individuals. Some might even have problems setting boundaries with their dogs and cats. That's actually happening. Recognizing emotions also means to recognize positive emotions like pride, love, excitement, which create motion in us. Emotion. To get things done, to reach our goals, to achieve a fulfilled life. So listening to all of your emotions is a great deal for man and woman. And I know that many men especially still struggle with this up to today, because especially we men learned the narrative to not be too sensitive, to not be too emotional. And again, that's also an illusion, because to be an authentic masculine being, you have to recognize your emotions, how you feel, to navigate and make good decisions. That's a proper skill for a man as well for a woman. How does emotional neglect shape or not shape our emotional world? As children, and also sometimes as adults, how do we learn to emotionally regulate ourselves? We perceive emotions that come up within us and try to connect with the outer world while feeling them. So we want to socially reference these sensations we feel inside with the environment outside. Okay, now I want to give you an example. Let's say you are a child and you're in the class for the first time. You haven't been to school before, you are new in this school, and you now have to adapt to certain situations and learn to regulate those emotional settings. No one in this class has done their homework, and you also forgot to do your homework. And the teacher is angry and yells at the class, "Why didn't you do the homework?" Because you all forgot. You're shocked in that situation, and fear rises within you that the teacher will yell at you specifically. How do you know how to react in this specific situation? Freak out, yell back at the teacher, or just keep quiet? You look around the class, and what you recognize is that no one of your other classmates does anything. Everyone remains quiet, and you just copy what the others are doing in this situation. No one is freaking out, everyone is quiet, so you do. After a while, the teacher calms down again. So you might learn from this situation, first of all, when someone is angry, they will calm down again at some point, when some time goes by. Second, you could learn when someone is angry, to feel safe again, just remain quiet. And that's a pretty simple example of how our emotional perception and processing forms through life experiences. And I love this example because we can spin around with it a bit more. So imagine you are in this exact same situation with the same kid. You are new in class, you don't know what to do, but the only difference is, as the teacher yells at the class, the other kids don't remain calm and instead react aggressively because somehow they learned that in their families. Now they yell back at the teacher, they insult the teacher. How would the outcome would look like now if you were in such a class and learn day by day that when someone is angry, you would yell back at them? Pretty different outcome and a pretty different learning effect on how you process and react on the emotion, for example, of anger here. Now, what's pretty interesting here, if you think about it, when you are that kid and you are afraid in that situation because you fear that the teacher is yelling at you, and you get the feedback when someone is angry and you are afraid of that, then you also react with anger, then your emotional reaction in the future might be a different one than if you learned that it's better to be quiet. So these situations shape how we react emotionally and how the emotional outcome will be, how we connect an emotion that we feel inside with the outside world. Because now every time that person might feel fear in the future, the person might react with yelling and screaming, where the person in the first situation might react with being quiet and withdrawing. It always gets pretty tricky when there is a mismatch between our inner emotional sensations and the outside reactions, especially in the early years. And I want to go through an example now with you how emotional neglect can look like in early childhood. Good. Imagine you are a child and you live with your parents and a dog in a house. Your family's dog is an old shepherd dog that you love a lot because the dog is calming, the dog helps you to co-regulate, the dog is one of your best friends. Sadly, because it's an old dog, the dog dies out of natural causes at some day, and you see that and you understand that the dog was old, so he's dying, but you feel super sad about it. You feel a lot of grief because you love that dog so much. And you go to your dad and cry and express your grief and your sadness, but your dad doesn't care because he avoids emotions like grief. He tells you, real man, don't cry. And you're even more sad and even a bit frustrated and angry that your dad doesn't mirror your emotion and you feel a bit confused. Why is dad not recognizing my emotion of grief? You don't understand at this point that your dad may have had difficult experience in his childhood. Because you're a child, you don't know that your dad is avoiding grief here. So you go to your mom and you tell your mom, "Mom, I'm so sad," and you cry in front of your mom. And you express the anger and the frustration you have that your dad doesn't care about your sadness. And your mom says to you, "Don't be like that," because she avoided anger since she was a child, because she has difficulties with that. And you're even more confused because now you have all these emotions inside you, that you feel sad, that you feel frustrated, you're full of anger, but somehow the outside world doesn't react the same way as you think, right? You get the message here that your emotional perception might be wrong because you don't get that mirrored from your parents. And I want to make that pretty clear by showing you these graphics here. If you watch that on YouTube now, I show you 3 different graphics. In the first slide, you will see here what the child sees. So that's the outer objective perception. And the child sees the dog dying. That's the input. The parents, the caregivers, also see the dog dying. That's also their outer objective perception. And what the child feels on the second slide, that's the child's inner subjective emotional perception, is grief, sadness, wants to cry. What the caregivers feel, so their inner subjective emotional perception, we don't know in that situation. So maybe they're a psychopath, they don't feel anything. We don't know. But let's say they also feel the same grief and sadness because they also love the dog. If they're not psychopath, they feel like this. Now the child's first reaction now on the third slide, and that's the processing, the inner processing of emotions and the try to find social references here, is first of all crying, expressing grief and also some frustration because the dad doesn't mirror that grief. But the caregiver's reaction, and that's the interesting point here, the processing of their inner emotions is no grief. Their reaction is, "I don't care if the dog died. I don't care because I avoid grief and sadness. I don't care if you're frustrated and angry because we don't mirror your emotions." And this is the point where the emotional neglect happens here. The child is super confused and doesn't understand why their parents react like this. It's also, by the way, the role of a parent or caregiver to help the child to make that proper connection between their inner sensation and what happens in the environment. So usually what a healthy caregiver would do within a healthy bonding to their child, they would go and help the child understand, process their grief and their sadness. Now regarding this example, if this happens once, that's okay maybe, but usually the parents avoid these emotions for a really, really long time. So it repeats for many times over the years and decades. And if you live in such a family dynamic, this will repeat itself. This is especially true for more subtle things. So a dog is not dying every day. That's totally true. But let's say the kid would tell their parents that the teacher, and the example before, was angry and that no one did their homework, and it made the child feel afraid because the teacher was yelling at him. But the parents, again, don't care about the child's feelings because they don't mirror that feeling of fear and grief and sadness. So the child internalizes, "I am too sensitive and I'm wrong." And this internalization, this manifests in shame-bound emotions. It awakes I call it cycle of toxic shame and guilt within us, We've talked about that a lot in the previous episodes. And we start masking, we start hiding and suppressions our emotions, needs, and we can't set boundaries because of that. And that's because we deeply believe that we can feel things that are wrong. I want to repeat these words because that's so important. That's the point where all these struggles we have as adults are born. We learn that we can feel things that are wrong, which is not the case. It's your parents that didn't mirror your emotions that are actually totally right because your dog died or because you're afraid of that new situation in class. But your parents didn't show you how to process these emotions, how to regulate these emotions. And I linked that video to the cycle of toxic shame and guilt up here or in the description so you can watch it if you want to dig more into that. Shame signals us what of our inner sensation is a wrong reaction to the outer input we have. This is what the child learned here. And if everything we are, everything we do, and everything we feel is constantly wrong, then we will chronically feel shame. Being in this cycle of toxic shame and guilt, that cycle will lead us to symptoms like emotional dysregulation, for example. Emotional dysregulation is a really heavy and impactful thing that results out of that. And it's not just typical in trauma, but it's also part of autism, of high sensitivity, ADHD, etc. But summarized, suppressed and masked emotions lead to outbreaks of anger, of grief, and of similar stuff. For example, if you react passively aggressive constantly around your partner and you always have that feeling that it's always about them and never about you, so some form of self-abandonment within your relationship, then you experience, this is what I said, emotional dysregulation. And I have also done an episode about that topic as well, which I also link up here and in the description below. That's a pretty important piece of the puzzle that you have to understand, because those emotional outbreaks are these things that make us human beings, us adults, struggle the most, especially when it comes to attachment and relationships. But of course, there are also many other symptoms that are caused by emotional neglect. And I have a list here, which I will also blend in now. So pretty much an endless list. But the most important ones are that people who experience childhood neglect, as I said before, often can't make decisions because they are not connected to their feelings, so they don't really know what they want. That also results in an inability to set clear boundaries because, again, they're disconnected from their emotions. And this disconnect from emotions also is related to sometimes a feeling of emptiness inside. It's connected to things like procrastination, because again, you don't know what you want, you don't know what you need if you ignore the emotional signals from inside. It's also connected with dissociation, because you are not associated with your emotions, so you are dissociated from them. You have, as I said, emotional outbreaks and dysregulation from time to time, heavy emotions that have a severe impact on your quality of life. If you suppress emotions for a really long time and might even suppress those emotional outbreaks, then this can lead to panic attacks, might also lead to depression out of that feeling of emptiness I was talking about. That will lead to toxic shame. Remember the cycle of toxic shame and guilt. Pretty typical is as well that many people who experience emotional neglect have a really thin skin, so they react irritated pretty soon when you criticize them, again, because they don't have the ability to set clear boundaries. They can't really say no, or they have the feeling that they have to justify themselves constantly. They feel lonely and have a strong need to be seen within relationships and also within daily life, usually within dating. They often feel also pretty needy within relationships, which also is related to limerence, for example, that they have this obsession when, for example, you meet someone and you really want to see that person from the beginning, you're obsessed with that person you barely know. Social anxieties are part of that as well, that you sometimes appear shy because you feel that there are some things that make you feel small, feel tiny, and you don't even know why. So also a sign for suppressed emotions. You might have an excessive need for attention, and those things can also lead to relationship conflicts. Let's say you are, for example, avoiding relationships completely because of this, because you can't set boundaries, or you are afraid of relationships, you're afraid of commitment, you're afraid of change in your life, but you can also be afraid of loss. So some people might stay away from relationships completely. Other people might stay away from being alone completely. So they always constantly have to be within a relationship. Things like sleeping problems, chronic stress, nightmares can also be part of that. Other people appear as a threat to you because, again, you can set boundaries. There is pain. There are somatic symptoms like pain, pressure in your gut, chest, and throat, or things like chronic fatigue. So you see, there are a ton of symptoms, and I think there are many more if I would expand that list now, but those are some which are directly related to the inability to connect with your emotions. And this is the foundation between why many relationships fail and why people have such difficult times to maintain healthy relationships. Some might also ask, why do we get freeze, fight, or flight responses from these symptoms? And this is because our central nervous system is also constantly involved in these reactions. So when we were left alone, for example, as children, when we were angry, in the young ages, when we were upset or sad, and we didn't learn ourselves to regulate these emotions, every time we feel such emotions, we maybe dissociate from ourselves and our emotions and freeze, get into this freeze state in our nervous system, because that's the only possible solution our nervous system finds to react to these emotions. Or, for example, when you are now an adult, what also can happen, what happens to a lot of us, we try to distract ourselves, to take the flight response, get out of that uncomfortable emotional state, switch to another topic, use our phone, things like this. Procrastination also results in here, but that's definitely a different topic. To summarize up to this point, what do we learn about emotional neglect? Childhood emotional neglect makes us disconnect from our sense of our own emotions. So we have a discrepancy between our inside subjective sensations and how we react to the outside and what our outside is mirroring to us. So we also might suppress different emotions, whatever you learn as a child. And for many of us, that results in an impairment of our emotional perceiving and processing, especially the processing is affected here. For example, and maybe you know this, maybe you have struggled with this yourself, or maybe you know someone who is like this, who struggles with obsessive infatuation and limerence. People who struggle with this, they meet someone completely new in a dating context, and they don't know this person at all, but they feel obsessive feelings when they just think about this person, but they barely know this person. So how could they feel these feelings? What actually happens during infatuation and during these states in detail, I explained in this episode about infatuation here. But all in all, it's like a feedback between the outer world, so the person they just met, and the inner world seems to not work accordingly. So there is something wrong with that feedback mechanism. In some scenarios, it appears to be too fast, Like in this case, okay, I just met this person once, so I'm totally in love with this person. That's way too fast. And in some cases, it can be delayed. For example, when we can't get over someone or something for a really, really long time, and even years later, we think about that person or that thing we think we love so much. So the problem here is that we do not do enough checking between our inner world and our outer world. Good. What happens within a healthy and secure attachment if we would have learned that all the emotions and needs we have within us are okay and that we could regulate and express them? If we would have such a secure attachment, we would constantly express our emotions authentically, if necessary, and then get feedback on them from other people and the outside world. So let's talk about solutions here. What is the solution to heal from emotional neglect and the disconnect between our sensations and the outside world when we are around other people? So this is what we struggle with, right? We have to do exactly that. We have to do more checks and calibration between our inner sensations and the outside world. And that can be quite difficult and frustrating because expressing our inner emotions is exactly what we didn't learn and what our body is trying to protect us from. I came up with 5 steps to go on this journey and to heal from childhood emotional neglect. I want to share these with you now. Step number 1, expanding your emotional vocabulary. Now, this can be done, for example, by such a circle of emotions. I also recommend to you to just print it on a piece of paper and then try to identify how you feel during the days. Emotions and states I always find pretty interesting to discover are things like feeling thin-skinned, feeling resentful, feeling aggravated. There is so much detailed vocabulary many of us never heard about when it comes to labeling inner sensations. That's the first step. Step number 2, when you have learned a lot of vocabulary about your emotional states, then it's time to self-attune more of your emotions with your environment. And to do so, you can use 5 different questions. During the day, and I know that's a lot of work because you've probably never did that, you can ask yourself, let's say, these questions 3 times a day in the beginning. Question number 1 is, how do I react emotionally if XYZ happens? Let's say you worked for 3 hours straight on your computer, and then just ask yourself, how do you feel in that moment? And I often feel pretty fatigued, tired in those moments. Before I didn't realize that, but as I try to attune with these emotions, then I understood that often this emotion comes up. Now, second question, when do I feel like this? For example, here, after 3 hours of work, I feel fatigued, tired. Why do I feel like this? That question is a bit more tricky because sometimes we don't know, but that is what the process is about, to find that out. Probably here because I didn't feel myself for too many hours because I was so distracted by my work. Question number 4, is it more difficult for me to feel this sensation and label it? That's sometimes true, for example, for emotions like anger or grief for some people, but it can be different and vary in emotions. And number 5, which emotion actually is this? In this example, it's the emotion of feeling fatigued and tired, which is somehow a kind of depressed and sad state. And the emotional circle really helps to identify emotional states and helps you to expand your vocabulary. Number 3, learning to tolerate all emotions. That's probably difficult, and this third step will definitely vary in most men and women because men and women learned as young boys and girls to express and feel different emotions. So for example, for a man it was not okay to feel pain, it was not okay to feel grief, but for a woman there was not a problem at all. So it's different in genders, but it also differs in the past experiences you've had. Some emotions will be easier to tolerate for you, some emotions will be more difficult. You definitely have to go in tiny steps and identify those emotions step by step. You can definitely use the 5 questions I gave you in step number 2 to identify especially which emotions you suppress more. For example, maybe it's grief, it's anger, from that example with the dog. A therapist definitely can also help you to address these emotions within a safe setting, because some of us might suppress many emotions really deeply and don't have a good access to them, don't feel safe addressing them. In these scenarios, therapy can definitely help to do that in a safe setting. Number 4, starting to communicate your emotions. Emotional neglect is an interpersonal wound, so it needs to be addressed interpersonally, so within relationships. And I would say now you've definitely read enough, you watched enough here. It's time to get out there in the real world and start getting new feedback on your emotional and inner states. And this step can be really challenging, I know that, but I would see it like this. Relearning to perceive and reprocess your emotions is like a riddle or a challenge which is fun to solve in the end. You don't need specialists or therapists necessarily for this training, but you need at least one person you trust in. And you can start in front of the mirror if you don't feel comfortable starting with another person. You can start with your dog or your cat if you have any in the beginning. They won't judge you for sure. The mirror also won't judge you, hopefully. With your partner, friends, and within a community, it's definitely the best. And the goal here is to get proper feedback instead of feeling that these emotions are wrong and that you have to mask them. Because this is what you didn't do as a child. This is what you didn't learn when you were younger. So now is the time to finally get there in tiny steps. And number 5, changing emotional perception and processing over time. When you went and probably go through these 4 steps to live in constant give and take with others and the world. And this way, over time, you will learn what you didn't experience as a child. You understand and start to believe that the feedback you get from others out there is nurturing to your inner world. You close this gap between your inner sensations and the feedback of the outer world that is causing so much pain and symptoms right now. Be prepared that this change will definitely feel really unfamiliar in the beginning, but this is where the actual growth is, because this is the missing sensation you didn't learn as a child. How do you feel when you are with other people and trying to connect with the outside world? Can you truly feel authentically what your emotions actually are during the day and during interactions with others? And some final thoughts from my side. What I found fascinating when I myself digged into the topic of emotional neglect for the first time is that the most difficult thing is probably not to step by step open up just in tiny steps to communicate emotions and learn to process emotions better. But I think the most difficult thing is to actually label and name different emotions, at least for me. So for me, it was so helpful, honestly, to just find names and vocabulary for different sensations that might be different for you. But as soon as you actually have a vocabulary and as you know how to label different feelings, it definitely gets easy. And I remember how excited I was when I finally realized what labels I can put on my emotions. And secondly, what's also a breakthrough moment for many people is the reclaim of this sensation, how a connection to your inner self actually feels like. And it's pretty difficult to describe, but I would put it in this word. It's a feeling or a sensation of yourself. Simple put, if you feel this, you may know what I mean by that, but you actually just feel connected with your emotions and with yourself, which is probably totally clear for everyone who never experienced emotional neglect, because those people learned that in the beginning of their life. But if that is a new feeling to you and you're somewhere in your adulthood, then this moment can be an absolute breakthrough. Now, what do you think about the topic? Have you experienced emotional neglect? Definitely leave me a comment below today's episode. And if you want to support the channel here, definitely leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I wish you all the best from the depth of my heart, lots of love, and I see you in the next episode. Have a great day.